and welcome to day 3. Now hopefully you've managed to watch days 1 and 2, but if not, no worries, you can go back and have a watch of them now. And today we're going to turn our attention to your classes. So who are you going to have in your classes? How many are you going to have? We've had a little think about how many, but only in terms of the space we need. Today we're going to think about how we decide how many kids to teach, and who to have in your class, how to group them, and of course how many classes you should be aiming to launch with. So how do you decide how many students to have in your class? Well, it's going to be largely down to your experience, your prior experience with groups of children. It's going to be down to how confident you're feeling teaching a group of children. Remember that you could start with fewer than you eventually want to have and then grow them. So you could start with 3 or 4 in a class knowing that eventually you want to teach 6. It's not only thinking about the management of behaviour that we need to be thinking about when we decide how many to have in our class. It's also the management of their learning. We would be doing a disservice to our children and to group piano in general if we didn't have the time, the means basically to nurture each individual child in our group class. Just because we're teaching a group doesn't mean that we are, blanket teaching and we're not thinking about the individuals. We're just delivering something and expecting them all to respond in the same way. They definitely won't. So not that I want to kind of make it sound daunting, but you definitely need to think about managing those learners' needs as well as managing the behaviour. If you have done early music classes, maybe you've been a school teacher like I was before I started my groups, well then you might find it easier to launch with the number that you eventually want to have. So I obviously, being a high school teacher, went from teaching 30 children at a time, so I'm actually very comfortable with 8 children, and I know that I can get around all of them. I know that I can give them all my individual attention during the lesson, making sure that I am supporting and extending them as required. I have on occasion pushed my groups to 10 if something happens, like someone's desperate to get in last minute or a sibling wants to join. And often when I have 10, if I'm in a 30-minute class, I won't get to the 10th. So I've said no to that now. But that's just what you learn through experience. I would expect most people to start with between 4 and 6. And with that number, you get a really nice group dynamic. But as I say, it's going to depend on how you're feeling about it, your space, and your past experience. So now here is a big question. How do you group your children? I've seen it done many different ways, and I'm going to tell you the way that I think works and why. But I will also tell you about some of the ways that others do it. So it really depends on how young you want to start, how young you want your beginners to be. I mean, what I will say is that we are talking here about starting your beginners in groups. So in other words, at least at the very first lesson, you know that everyone has the same skill set. In other words, no prior experience. I know that some people like to group their classes by ability and skill, which you will eventually need to do. This is what I do now. But at the beginning, when you're at this stage, when you're about to launch, they're all beginners. So then you need to think about the age. So if you wanted to start younger beginners, I think for me, if we think about how kids are learning in school, the types of activities that they're doing, the expectations that teachers have of them, whether they're in formal school or not, is a really good place to start. So I would separate out, I start my kids at age 4, and I would separate them out. I teach my age 4 to 5 together, and then I would teach my age 6 plus together. And in my age 6 plus, they tend to get age 6 to 10, and I would have them all together. That's absolutely fine. And the reason being is because if you think about in a wider educational context, ages 4 to 5 is still very much learning through play and discovery. They're not necessarily expected to sit and listen to 2-step instructions. They would probably have to listen to 1-step instructions, but not 2-step. They would not be expected to have a particularly long attention span in terms of listening to a teacher. So therefore, you need your pace, you need your activities to be very, very fast, but also quick changes, like changes of activity type. So I would have them over here, and then they're over here, and then they're over here, and there's only minutes on each activity, and we're colouring, and then we're singing, and then we're waving scarves, and then we're at the keyboards. I wouldn't expect them to be on the keyboards for all that long. I have my kids put headphones on, as I've explained to you before, so that I can do that lovely individual differentiation with them. But with the 4 to 5 year olds, I would only expect them to wear them for minutes out of the 30 minutes that I teach them. So that is a very different requirement to your age 6+, where by age 6 they are expected to sit and learn in a classroom. Music being a wonderful subject, and the piano being a wonderful subject, where everything's going to be very practical and very creative. So when I say sit and listen, I don't mean we're kind of going to get them to sit and write an essay or anything, but they will expect to listen to a teacher and take instructions. So that's why I separate those two kind of groups by age. Once you are slightly beyond the beginner stages, and in fact you'll notice straight away, not so much with the 4 to 5 year olds, but definitely with the age 6 to 10, and it doesn't necessarily, you won't necessarily get your 10-year-olds being faster than your 6-year-olds, because they're all individual, so you can't necessarily put so much value on age. What I'm trying to say is that with my 6 to 10-year-olds, I definitely notice almost straight away a difference in how they're accessing the lessons. So you would, even though we've got all the beginners, they're all the same skill set from the very beginning, there's not a huge age range, you will still need to think that they are going to move at slightly different paces. You're going to have some kids that move faster than others. It's just what happens. And we absolutely can cope with that in a group with some very particular systems in place. So you need, I'm going to go through this more with lesson management and lesson structure, but you need an overall set of objectives that you're expecting everyone to be able to achieve. And then you also need further challenges for those people that are moving faster, and support for those people that are not quite keeping up, because it's so important to be able to deal with all those individuals. So in other words, the skills and kind of grouping people by skill, even if they're all beginners, you'll find that they'll move away from each other fairly quickly. I have them from the very first lesson doing different things to each other, not different pieces, but just different things within a piece. And then beyond that, I mean, if I'm honest, I thought that I was going to be teaching beginners in a group program, thought Keynotes Music was going to be a program for beginners. But what happened over the last 5 years is that all of my kids stayed with me. They loved the groups. They didn't want to move on to one-to-one, which is what I assumed they would do. So we've now got a program called Foundations that takes them beyond the beginner stages. And then we've also got stuff that we do beyond that. So I do then tend to keep them in groups by skill. And even though I'm differentiating and each person will be doing something slightly different, the skill set is not so extreme that I've got a beginner with a grade 4 pianist, or, I don't have an extreme skill spectrum in my class ever, because I think their needs are so different. So that's how I group them. Now, in terms of what I've seen other people do, I think people tend to put the 3 and 4 year olds together, and then the 5 and 6 and 7 together. I really think 5 and 6 year olds are very, very different. So that's why I don't do that. And I think 3 year olds need something different entirely. I think they need more of an early years program, more generic, more kind of about learning to to keep the beat and, you know, singing and all of that kind of thing. But from 4, I feel like we can formally ask them to play something at the piano. So the other way that you could group them is to have to have everyone, multi-age, multi-level. Again, I think that the needs are so different that it's very difficult to plan your content so that everyone is, you know, to have objectives that suit everyone's needs. So that's what I do. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are around this. And next, we're going to talk about how many classes you should launch with. Now, how many classes you should launch with is largely going to depend on the demand in your area. So you might start kind of promoting your classes, and you might find that there's a lot of demand. You might find that there's less demand. But what I tend to say, lots of people I've spoken to have kids on a waiting list, beginners on a waiting list, and those are the first people that they would approach to try and get a group together. If you need more children, a great way to get more kids in is to ask them if they'd like to bring a friend. So ask the parents if they'd like to spread the word for you about these classes starting. That's always been a great way to get more people. But what I tend to recommend, if you were going to go down the route of separating your beginners into the 4 to 5 year olds and into the age 6+, I would recommend initially starting with one of each of those classes. So you've got one class of 4 to 5 year olds, one class of age 6+. And if after everyone's booked their 3-week trial, you find that you've got full classes and you've got more people asking, well, then you could, you know, potentially start with another class. It really depends on how confident you're feeling, how much time you have. What's good about starting with another class as well is that your you know, the content is going to be is going to cross over from the 2 classes of the same age. So you could do it that way. And then eventually, as time goes on and as the word gets around, I've got parents asking me to start a new class. They're like, we'll get some other kids, please start a new one. But I actually don't have time. 6 classes in a row is about my limit. That's when at the end of 6 classes I've got very little energy left. I did at one point teach 9 classes with a little break after the first 2 and then 7, and I was absolutely shattered by the end of that day, so I cut it right back. So now I do 6. But what I was saying was that if you want to then add on groups, you know, further down the line, so after your first semester or term of teaching, you can then, that group would kind of keep going along, and then you can bring a brand new beginner group in. Okay, so that's definitely perfectly possible. So I wouldn't set anything in stone in terms of how many you want to start with, but I would say one of 4 to 5 and one age 6+ is a really good place to start. So that's it. That is all about your classes and how they should be grouped. Now, as always, if you have any questions, if any of this has brought up queries for you or indeed clarification, do let me know. You can post in the comments underneath this video, or you can email me. Either way, I'd be very happy to chat to you about this and to talk through your own setup and your own situation. Okay, see you tomorrow.